the other pitcher St. Louis traded was Jordan Hicks to Toronto. What are they getting? And more importantly, for a lot of the baseball nerds out there, what are they giving up?
So Hicks is one of the hardest throwers in all of baseball. He might be the hardest thrower right now, actually, currently among major league starters. He's always had tremendous stuff. I remember seeing him probably 5-6 years ago when he was still a prospect and just started throwing extremely hard. Always had a good arm, but got to this point where he was pretty consistently hitting or even sitting at triple digits. That said, he's not actually all that effective for a guy who throws that hard. He is really erratic. It's below average control. He's consistently had high walk rates whenever he's been healthy and in the majors. And the command is worse than the control. He is a useful part of a bullpen. I think if you look at him and look at the fastball velocity and think, oh, this guy is an Aroldis Chapman at his peak, a late game reliever, high leverage reliever. I don't know that he's that. I don't know that he is consistent or reliable enough to be the guy you bring in for your highest leverage work in the 8th and 9th innings. Now, that said, I don't think the Blue Jays paid a huge prospect price. They traded Sam Robersa and Adam Kloffenstein. Robersa is really interesting because he's Dutch, like truly Dutch, not a Ruben or Curacao. And he's a Dutch-born kid who the Blue Jays signed for not all that much money when he was still throwing in the mid-80s. And his velocity has crept up to where he's more 90, 92, maybe up to a 94, 95 right now. Pretty good secondaries. Throws a lot of strikes, great delivery. The fastball just isn't there yet. And I was really hopeful this would be the year his fastball would take a step forward and you could really talk about him as maybe a mid-rotation starter. He's just still not there. He's still young. There's still a chance he's going to get there. But of course, every year that doesn't happen decreases the probability of it happening at some point. And they also traded Adam Kloffenstein, who was drafted. He was Jordan Grosjean's high school teammate. Blue Jays took both kids in the same draft, paid Kloffenstein a pretty big bonus, and he's just not been very good. He's taken a small step forward this year to the point where you might think of him, maybe he's a big league reliever at some point. I think that's about the upside. So, Roberson we could be talking about him this time next year and say, oh, the Blue Jays gave up a good one. But there's also a chance he just ends up a 5th or 6th starter because he just doesn't throw hard enough. So I view this package for the Blue Jays as completely reasonable for what they got. They did not pay a premium price for just to get Hicks velocity. I think they paid an appropriate price given Hicks uncertainty.
So Keith, at some point we definitely want to get your take on the Blue Jays sort of farm system and the top prospects and where they are. But prior to that, I'm fascinated by sort of the American League in general, and particularly what the Rangers have done in terms of really going all in. And even the Angels made some really interesting moves in the last 24 hours or so. Holistically, where do you see the Jays with obviously the Hicks move? Maybe they'll bring a bat in. We'll see sort of what happens in relation to the other teams, the Rangers, the Astros, the Rays, the Orioles, because at a certain point, all this lines up for the playoffs, right? So who in your opinion, as of now, is in the best position to really make a run, and where do you see the Jays within that position?
Yeah, I see the Jays as, I understand they're in 3rd place. They're 6 games behind the first place Orioles in the loss column right now, 3 behind the Rays. I think they are a comparable team, at least on paper. Now I understand they're 59 and 47. That's their Pythagorean record based just on the runs scored and the runs allowed this year. I feel like they've had, between some injuries, a little underperformance here and there. I thought they'd be a little bit better, but I also recognize that the Orioles in particular, I think, have just been way better probably than anybody expected. And I think they're legitimately a great team. There's nothing, so it's not a criticism of the Blue Jays that they're behind them. It's just that's kind of how the season has shaken out. And the Blue Jays probably needed to get a little luckier to keep pace with the Orioles. In 6-game deficit with 2 months left in the season, not insurmountable, but you also need to start looking at the number of teams that the club you're following would have to jump over, say, to get into a playoff spot. For the Blue Jays to win the division, they don't just have to catch one team, they have to catch 2 teams because the Rays are in between. For them to, I guess right now they'd be in the 6th playoff spot. So they're 2 games ahead of the Red Sox, 3 games ahead of the Yankees, 4 ahead of the Angels and Mariners. So they're in a good position to get into the playoffs in the last wild card spot. And I do very much believe in the dictum that says just get in. The number one thing about the playoffs is just get in. Truly anything can happen once you're in. You can get, whether it's lucky or hot at the right time, however you want to describe it, like the Phillies did last year and end up in the World Series. So I look at the Blue Jays. I think their odds of winning the division are probably not that great, not impossible, but it should be much more about let's just get in with one of those wild card spots. You've got a lead in there right now. You do have a fair bit of control over your own destiny because two of the teams chasing you are behind you in the standings. So I think they're in pretty good position to end up making the playoffs. Would still probably like to see them patch the roster a little bit around the edges, which is, I think, what they were doing with the Hicks trade. But otherwise, I do think if we have this conversation again on October 1st, we're going to be talking about the Blue Jays as a playoff team.
One more for me, John. Keith, so, having I've watched every game this year. Maybe not all 9 innings of every game, but in some position every game. And if you've watched the Blue Jays all year, you've seen they really have struggled with runners in scoring position. That's been a killer for them. Their record in 1-run games has been rough for them, and obviously, which is the big story, their record against the AL East, and in particular, a couple of teams have really, really hurt them. If you want to take the optimistic view, you say that Vladdy has to have a better second half than a first half. Manoah has to be better in the second half than the first half, because that's almost inconceivable, right? And then you have Ryu coming back, and maybe that's a starter that you didn't have before. So he gives you some length in the starting rotation. And then, as you mentioned earlier, you have all these relievers. The relief core is much better today than it was at the start of the season. Is that the Ross Atkins argument that, like, there's not a guy out there that maybe can that we're going to, we're not getting Juan Soto or somebody like that. But if these things happen, which is realistic, we are as good a team as anyone else in terms of having a shot to get to the World Series.
Yeah, I think that's pretty plausible, actually. And I do think the part of the problem they have, if I'm in Ross Atkins' shoes, is I'm looking at the roster, and as right now I'm literally looking at the roster on Baseball Reference and saying, what's the easy spot to upgrade, right? You're not upgrading over George Springer. Even, he's having obviously a very disappointing season, but that's not, first of all, you've made a huge investment in him. They're not likely to choose to do that. And second is, I don't know that there's a player out there who the Blue Jays are likely to get who's a clear upgrade there, or over Dalton Varsho, who's probably the most disappointing of all of the offensive players on the Blue Jays this year. You could argue they could do something with Manoah's spot and just say, look, we can't wait. Manoah's whatever's going on with him. And I was really coming out of last year, I thought that's their ace or their co-ace. It is absolutely mystifying what's happened to him. But, if they wanted to say, we just need to move on for the rest of this year, we'll figure Manoah out in the off season, next spring, et cetera. That's probably the biggest thing that they could do, where there would be adding one player to significantly improve the roster. Everything else is, like I said, it's around the edges. It's patching up in the bullpen, for example. It's maybe patching up the bench or adding a better platoon mate for, say, a Varsho in left field, little things like that. And if that's all they do towards the deadline, that's fine, because I agree with what you called your Ross Atkins argument that this team is really good on paper. It's hard to keep in mind. Yeah, they're in third place in the last playoff spot. They're also 12 games over 500. They are playing well. It just happens that they're in easily the most competitive division in baseball right now. And in a year where the tops of the American League East, the American League, well, the East and the West, not the Central, are pretty strong. And so it's just a highly competitive season. And so being 12 games over 500 at this point just barely gets you into a playoff spot.
12 games over 500, yes. 13 games under 500 against the American League East, and they have Baltimore in town. Is there any way to explain that, Keith? Any way? I mean, it's remarkable.
No, it's bad luck more than anything. I don't think there's such a thing as a team that is, what would that be? They're 25 games over 500 against everybody else and 13 under against the American League East. That's not that is a bit of randomness. It's kind of like the hitting with runners in scoring position thing. I understand that that's absolutely what's happened so far this year, but hitting with runners in scoring position is not a different skill than hitting. And if you look, they're a really good hitting club. They're a good hitting club for contact. They actually don't strike out very much at all, and they get on base at a good clip and they hit for some power. This is a good hitting club. if you just going forward, I would expect them in the rest of the season to hit as well with runners in scoring position as they do in all other situations. You could argue they'll have a worse record against the AL East than they do against the rest of baseball, continuing the rest of the season, because the AL East is just that strong. However, their absolutely abysmal performance so far this year against the American League East seems impossible to sustain. They are not that bad of a club, certainly. And it is, I mean, they're at the leftmost tail of randomness here, that it is hard to believe any club could be this consistently bad against 4 other teams in the division, even in the division as good as the AL East is.